Hello and welcome. Episode 4, Taking Notes, is out of the Magnus protocol. So we're going to talk about it, and I took a lot of notes. So let's start off here with the designation, and as always, thanks so much for listening. We're going to do a non-spoiler section for the Magnus archives. We're still going to talk about the entire episode, but we're going to do a non-spoiler section for the Magnus archives for those who are listening that haven't yet started the Magnus archives. And then we'll do the spoiler section of the Magnus archives. And I have a new theory or an update to my previous theory from those spoiler sections. So if you're interested in that, please stick around. But first,
Welcome to the full spectrum. We have so much to share. Welcome to the full spectrum. Trey's allergic to
our designation here is CAT 3C7-494-191-831-290-12024, and it's under collection and blood and things like that, and we're going to get to all of that as well. But beware, this one gets a little grisly. This one starts with Sam having triggered a security notification that Alice got for some reason. Maybe Freddy is trying to help Sam and protect him. Maybe Freddy is trying to make sure that they don't look too deep into things with also not bringing anything down on top of them. But either way, she warns him pretty quick, hey, don't look into that. Don't look into the Magnus Institute. Don't look into the protocol. And when he asks about the protocol, she mentions that it's Starkwall involved. And he brings up the San Pedro Square massacre, because Starkwall is a PMC, a privatized military corporation. Is that what PMC stands for? Now that I say that out loud, I think so. I'm probably wrong, and somebody will tell me in the comment section. Anyway, it's a mercenary corps, basically. Something happened with the Magnus Institute that caused the protocol to be instituted, to be utilized. And it seems like a bunch of people died, and I'm really excited to get to hear more about what happened there. Not to hear about a bunch of people dying, but to hear about what caused it and how it happened. Why was it necessary? Because the Magnus Institute here is there's a lot of mystery going on with it, right? We don't know what happened necessarily to this Magnus Institute, even though we know what happened to our Magnus archives. So we will see how things go there. Augustus kicks in here, and I am pretty sure I know who this is, as we'll talk about in the spoiler section, but we're not going to touch that here. But Augustus speaks in when Gwen has a file to play, and they mention that it's a special occasion, that he reads the I've got it written here in my notes, that he reads such lovely stories. And the story that Augustus tells, which again, great voice acting all around, but the story that Augustus tells is about a man and a violin. I have a fascination with the idea of like the Dark Fiddler, otherworldly entity. And that's not quite what's happening here, but it is close. And I've had that ever since I read The Music of Eric Zahn by H.P. Lovecraft. Absolutely wonderful story. It's a little small one. It doesn't have a lot of like extra monster showing up here and there or anything like that. It is just a wonderful little story about a viol. And this story made me think a lot about The Music of Eric Zahn, which again, seminal to my love of horror. And I need to do a video at some point on why I love horror so much, because it was reading stories like that chilled me to my bone, that, as they say in Sobote Must Be Destroyed, that shook my brain, that made me want to read more. And this story is kind of special to me because of that. This is a guest writer, Cole Weavers, and it really does work. And I think Cole did a great job of making this feel very Magnus while also being well written. A lot of research, and it's very clear they did a lot of research. You just Google Royal Court Orchestra, you're not going to get the Royal Court Orchestra of the Palatinate You get the Mannheim School, you get the Royal Court Orchestra of Sweden. So they did that extra digging to a real place that has a lot of history and a lot of names attached to it. And I think it really shows. The only major complaint I have is we don't get a name for this author, not Cole, for the author of the note in the story. And because of that, when I talk about the author, I'm going to be talking about the author of the note and not the author of the story, even though I'm also talking about the author of the story in this video. I'm going to refer to them as the author and Cole. Please don't misunderstand and get confused. I really wish we got a name for the author in this episode because it would have made this a lot easier. But the author here gives a handful of names later on in the story of people that went to the Mannheim School that they were very impressed by, that made an impact on them, really shook the world in their view. And those aren't necessarily the names I would have answered with if you asked me my favorite composers that came from the Mannheim School. So I think it's just a really nice touch that, again, Cole didn't just pick the most popular people, picked ones that would make sense for the author to have. And just, again, I spent 5 videos, over 200 reviews in those 5 videos, talking about how great the writing from the main Magnus staff is. And so I wanted to highlight when these guest writers are here, and I want to give a special shout out to last episode to Graham, who came and had a wonderful conversation with me in the comments. Big shout out to Graham and that wonderful episode that was episode 3. But let's talk about what happens in episode 4. So this is, as I said, the story of a man with a violin and how he got it. He's trying to leave it to his nephew. And he recounts how there's been a great deal of rain recently, which is interesting, and how it's been soothing his soul, and it reminded him of better times when his nephew was there and all the time they spent together. And so he wants to send this fiddle to him. He wants to trust this violin to him. Then we get into the actual story of how he got it, and his goal to play at the Royal Court Orchestra, the Platinet, to go to the Mannheim School and to be able to prove himself there and become a singular talent, and that all the world would know him because, as we find out, he is the bastard son of a noble and he cannot rise to power in any way that he wants to. And so he's got another avenue to try and be able to take the fame that he believes he is due. His tutor, Oliver Bardwell, is someone that he does not get along with very well. He calls him a vexatious man who takes all of his credit and instead claims that all of the author's talent is because of Bardwell himself, not because of any skill that he might have. However, when he goes to travel to Mannheim, it's not his father that goes with him, it's Bardwell. And along the way, things get interesting. Along the way, Bardwell almost seems like he's listening to some distant music, and before... the author probably could have helped him. I was going to say before the author could do anything to help him. He even mentions he probably could have done something, but he was gripped in terror and awe, and he could do nothing as Bardwell flings open the carriage door and throws himself out of it, dashing his head upon a rock, and is killed instantly. When the coachman and the author approach the body, the author foolishly says, "What are we going to do?" instead of anything else. Which leads, because he didn't like Bardwell, right? Which leads the coachman to think that he threw him out of the carriage, turn on him, and although we're not told what happens next, it's implied that he kills him. The author kills the coachman to be able to escape scot-free. He wanders into the woods where he meets a refined gentleman that has some curious artifacts here. He has some special things in a sack, and he's got what seems to be a charred animal corpse on the fire. I have a lot of thoughts about this guy. We'll get into them in spoilers because I can't talk about them without referencing Magnus Archive stuff. However, this man, he has a strange sack with a bunch of things in it, as I mentioned, and he has a strange attitude here. He says, and I quote, "Fortune does seem to have forsaken you. Indeed, I would suggest a stroke of luck is much in order." Which is, again, I have a lot of thoughts. We're going to get to them. The author sees battered knives, and I have this list written verbatim from the transcript, which, again, if you're not reading the transcript along with the episodes, you really should read the transcript. Absolutely worth it. battered knives, chipped porcelain, fine jewelry, small ivory figures, and a set of gambler's dice. There's probably more in there, right, that we just see, because from that bag he produces the violin. But then he says, is this the face of fortune today? Talking about the violin that he has presented to the author, and if the author wants it. The author says that he can't afford it, he doesn't have anything, and he's not used to not having anything to be able to offer. And the man says, then let us not consider it a purchase, but a gift from a true friend. And again, I have a lot of thoughts. I'm going to get to that. The author then takes the violin. The man kicks dirt on the campfire, and the author leaves. A few hours down the road, Anaheim School's right there. Crazy, isn't it? So, he goes and presents himself. He begins to play, and I didn't mention this, but when he was first playing with the violin, he cut his finger, and he thought it was an accident. But here he finds out that as he begins to play, the violin cuts him and drinks deep of his blood. He plays a wonderful melody. As the pain fills him, he plays a beautiful melody, and he's accepted into the school. But each time that he plays, the violin takes its price. He realizes that he is the instrument. The violin is the true player. He can't give this up because this is the fame and prestige he finally wanted. It's not a lot of it. It never reaches the level of a lord like he wanted, or of a noble. But it's enough that he gets students. And from these students, he finds out one singular truth, as he calls it. The blood that feeds the violin need not be his own. So, he begins taking students that were underprivileged or unable to afford classes or that won't be missed. He begins feeding them to the violin. Only once, he says, did he play without feeding it from himself or anyone else. Covered his hands, and the music was even more lively than before. The whole room erupted, not in joy and, excitement at this beautiful playing, but instead in mania, as old Bardwell did long ago. They become overcome with the desire to slaughter, and they kill each other brutally. It is very visceral, the description, as people bite off other people's cheeks, and that's as far as I'm going in these descriptions, because I would like to stay monetized on YouTube. This is one of my jobs, after all. But we'll talk about that after a spoiler. Well, he says that perhaps the nephew will prove even stronger than the author and be able to get rid of it, or be able to resist the urge, but he cannot. And then he says something really special here. He found a sanctuary woven from ethereal threads as he played. The music was somewhere he could be safe. Ethereal threads. To that as well. Then we cut back to the office, and Alice mentions that Augustus, again, as I mentioned earlier, always tells the most lovely stories. Sam asks why something from the 18th century would show up here. Gwen informs him that it was probably just recently digitized, triggered Freddy to be able to pull it up. After Sam and Alice leave, Gwen gets a really interesting email with a man that we learned from the transcript and from the description, if you're not checking that, whose name is Klaus, who tells the person he's talking to in the video that you don't have to do this, or in the recording at least. And a younger Lena says, we both know that I do. And the video cuts, and the episode cuts. So let's talk about this episode real quick before we get into spoilers. I think, again, I mentioned it earlier, very, very good. I think this episode gives us a lot more things to ponder. It's the first time we get to hear Augustus. We get to hear about this protocol and Starkwall, which is interesting. Definitely want to know what's going on with the San Pedro Square massacre. And we also get the idea that Lena is hiding something and maybe murdered Klaus. We don't know who Klaus is yet. Could wind up being important. I think this is going to tie into the mystery of the system. it sent the emails from Sam, the notifications that he triggered, to Alice, and for some reason, Freddy sent these emails in. And I'm really excited as we move forward into the series. Now, at this point, we're putting on spoilers. This is your last warning before we get into Magnus Archive spoilers. I've been holding something back all this time, and I have to say it now. So spoilers start now. Grifter's Bone! It's Grifter's Bone, man. It is the slaughter, Grifter's Bone. I'm not saying the nephew was Grifter's Bone and that's how it happened, but this is exactly what happened in Grifter's Bone, right? The instrument played, the music made them go crazy, made them kill each other. People ripped off their own ears to be able to escape. It's Grifter's Bone. So stoked. As soon as I heard the Mania, and it was like he was listening to different music with Bardwell, I was like, is that Grifter's Bone? Grifter's Bone? Is that you? Yeah, it is. It's Grifter's Bone. But there's more to this as well that I want to bring up. I have in the past been very sure about an entity when I go, well, it's this one. And I have in the past of these reviews talked about how my theory was that they had mixed and blended all in together. Even though they kind of already were blended, right? It's just each circumstance would have one entity that rose above the others. I'm wondering now if instead it's the opposite of my mixing theory. And what if they're splintered? What if they're fractured even more? So much so that each one operates on a different level now. They're all still the same organs in one body, right? Colors on a color wheel. But what if now there's more colors? And they're all smaller, and they all still blend a little bit into each other. But what if now there's more colors? And I say that because in this episode, and things from previous episodes as well, but in this episode, this feels like, how do I word this? In this episode, we have a refined gentleman. Now, this refined gentleman, there's a lot of little details about him that make me think that he might be an avatar of the Hunt, right? He's got all these interesting, weird artifacts, knives that have become battered, pieces of vases or vases that have been broken. He's got a set of gambler's dice. And you could easily say, well, maybe he's Death, right? An avatar of the End or something like that. But I feel like it'd be weird for if it was just, hey, you know, we need to be able to have the tools to be able to play the games. If you had pieces of ivory or porcelain, the ivory could make sense if it's game pieces like chess pieces. What about the shards of porcelain? That doesn't quite make sense to me. And then there's the fact that the thing that's on the campfire that he offers to Arthur here is a piece of game, assumedly, that has become so scorched it's almost ash. Charred almost to ash. Which means he's not cooking it and eating it for the taste. Which makes me feel like he's cooking it and eating it because he hunted it. And it almost feels like this man is hunting down artifacts, special items of some kind. But it's the way he mentions fortune that really drove it home for me. Because what if this is another aspect of the hunt in that it's, I got lucky on my hunt today. I achieved success on my hunt today because fortune was with me. Lady Luck was with me, right? What if they fractured even more? And the reason you could say, well, that's just, you're just looking into it too much. But the violin here hungers for blood. It's not just the slaughter. It's not just, hey, everything needs to die. You can play it and it not kill anybody by just feeding it blood. I shook my entire desk there. What if they fractured and so now there is a subset of the slaughter and the flesh that is just blood? But it can still do both, right? So it could still do Grifter's Bone slaughter, and it could still peel the flesh off your fingers. But what it really wanted was the blood. What if we have the End and the Hunt, and in between is, hey, I'm a fortunate man indeed, for I found what I was looking for. Fortunate that you found us here. Fortune seems to have forsaken you, but it seems like a stroke of luck is in there. The gambler, right? In between the two. And I know I'm probably wrong, right? But when I look back at the painter, and you have that little bit of flesh and spiral, right? And then maybe you have another distinction from it. Or you have the tree, right? And you have the vast for how the garden continued to expand, along with, it could be a couple different fears there, honestly, but corruption is the first one that I think of. Maybe it's a subset of that, right? I could very much be wrong, but I think it'd be really interesting either way, if it's a fusion of all of them, or if it is a fractured version where they've broken down even more into further subsets. And I brought up the ethereal threads earlier. Still be the influence of the web in everything, because the web just can't let go of being in charge, right? Finally, I want to talk about Augustus here, because I'm 100% positive right now that's Jonah. And you might say, well, how can you be 100%? You can't know. I don't know. I just don't see it being anybody else but Jonah Magnus reading that. We know that the JMJ stuff, John, Martin, Jonah, that it would make perfect sense to me. Norris, Chester, Augustus, exact same way. I believe that Augustus talking here is Jonah Magnus, and he likes to read the really interesting ones. He likes to read the really grisly ones. He likes to know, to see, right? And it could just be that he read this one because it was old, and he's old, and it made him happy. But I really do think it's him. Anyway, I don't mean to just continue going on and on here. Grifter's Bone, great to have this reference to it. Made me super stoked as soon as I saw it, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. I'm excited to get a bunch of comments that are just like, Grifter's Bone! But let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And until next time, I've been Trey. This has been The Full Spectrum. Remember to always enjoy the full spectrum. Magnus Protocol has to offer.